This is Mesa, and I have a bit of a track record of talking about her on this channel. I mean, after all, she was the Wisp before Wisp, the Ember Heirloom before Ember Heirloom, the Korra before… You know what, I think you get the point. She good. But what if I told you that she just got even better? That's right, Mesa can AoE clear now. Big shoutouts to all our generous channel members. And now, let's check out the new build. Very quick announcement though before we start. This video right here has a second part, a little companion video of sorts, over on my second channel, MHBlacky 2, exploring a different Mesa synergy that is very underused but super strong and fun to play. I'm gonna put you the video in the cards right here, so you can check it out later if you like. As per usual, let's first though talk about her abilities, but here I want to say that we're not going to get into a crazy detailed deep dive here because I've already talked about Mesa multiple times. Instead, I'm just going to give you a quick overview so that everybody is on the same page. First of all, her passive ability is very simple. You gain 15% more fire rate with akimbo pistols, 25% more reload speed with one-handed pistols, and a whopping 50 more maximum health if you have no melee weapon equipped. That one is pretty trash, but overall some decent stat boosts. Ability number 1 is called Ballistic Battery, and this one is a pretty interesting one. What it does is it records damage that you dish out with your guns, and when you tap the button again, it will give a massive damage bonus to your next shot. Overall, this is very niche, most builds don't utilize this ability, but if you combine it with a weapon where one bullet has a long lifetime, like for example the Grimoire or maybe the Cedo, where with its alt fire you shoot a disc that bounces between a lot of enemies for a while, then this massive buff to one shot can actually be pretty fun, and there are some niche builds that are pretty strong with it. But quick spoiler, today's video is not going to focus on this mechanic, so we're going to replace this ability with something else from the helmet. Skill number 2 is called Shooting Gallery, and this one is pretty nice, nothing crazy, but still useful. You get a buff that gives you more weapon damage, and also it will occasionally jam the weapons of nearby enemies. You, as Mesa yourself, will have this buff on you constantly, but if you play together with others, then there's going to be a second instance of this buff, which will periodically jump between them and bestow said buffs on them too. There is also an augment called Muzzle Flash, which occasionally will blind nearby enemies. This one definitely has some uses, but usually I end up not going for it. Overall, Shooting Gallery is nothing crazy, but you know what, a free damage bonus is something that I'll never say no to. Ability number 3 is the strongest damage reduction ability in the game in the form of Shatter Shield. This one gives Mesa up to 95% damage reduction against all types of bullets, and it will redirect some of that damage towards the enemies that shot it at you. Now, first of all, this damage redirection might as well not be there. That is never why we use this ability. The reason why we want to have it is because you get 95% damage reduction towards enemy fire. This is incredible and makes Mesa super duper tanky and survivable. Just keep in mind here, you're only protected against enemy fire. Melee attacks, explosions, any type of AoE effects, that will still hit you for the full damage, meaning you gotta pay attention to what's going on screen. It also has an augment called Staggering Shield, but to be 100% fair, I don't think this one is all too amazing. And finally, we have the one ability that everybody knows Mesa for, and that would be her Regulators, her double pew-pew pistols with 50 gazillion% fire rate that absolutely delete everything and makes her one of the most played and enjoyed Warframes in the game. Yeah, you have the Regulators, these are your exalted akimbo pistols, and the way they work is, you have a targeting area on screen in which Mesa is automatically gonna shoot at enemies. This skill has a 50-meter range, so it's pretty good. It should be said though that this range cannot be modded at all. While you have the Regulators out, you can't walk around, but you can still roll to move, and there's even an augment that helps with that called Mesa's Waltz, which allows you to slowly walk around in Regulator mode too. Overall, it always comes down to personal preferences, but I really like this. And as always, if you could leave a quick like for the video, that'd be super cool because it helps Uncle Blacky big time with the YouTube algorithm. Cheers so much for your support. But yeah, now we have a somewhat decent overview of Mesa's abilities. Number 1 is not going to be used and replaced with something else from the helmets. We're going to get into that when we talk about the Mesa build. Number 2 is a little damage buff that we're just gonna try to have on all the time. Number 3 keeps us alive, we also want to have that on constantly. And then number 4, the Regulators, is the main bread and butter of today's build because that is your big bada boom ultimate that shoots everything on screen. So before we jump into the Mesa build itself, it is crucial that we first take a look at what exactly we're gonna do with the Regulators. See, when it comes to the stats, the Regulators are a very good crit weapon. You have a base crit chance of 25%, which is fairly decent, but a 3 times crit damage multiplier, which is very strong and definitely what we're gonna build for. Also, by default, these pistols have a maximum fire rate of round about 15 rounds per second, which is crazy because unlike pretty much every other weapon in the game, the Regulators never need to be reloaded. They have infinite ammo, meaning you can stack fire rate upon fire rate upon fire rate on them, and it will always be a net benefit and DPS increase. The only little problem with the stats here would be the status chance, because at a base of 10%, it is definitely not terrible, especially given the high fire rate, but still, it's not necessarily something that I would recommend building for. So yeah, long story short, the Regulators are a strong crit weapon with a very high fire rate, and in my past videos, what I usually did is fully dive into the crit, giving Mesa the craziest crit buffs possible to get the big red numbers on screen. And while this was definitely nice and still is very strong, there was always one single problem that big time bothered me here, and that is the fact that the Regulators, for all their power, are just a single target weapon. If only there was a way to give Mesa AoE damage. You guessed it, that's right baby, we're gonna go with Secondary Irradiate of course. For everyone who hasn't heard of it, this arcane was introduced with a new update last week, and what it does is, when you hit an enemy that has the maximum of 10 radiation stacks on them, you will deal 180% of the damage that you deal to them to all other enemies in a 7-meter AoE. And as you can imagine, with a strong fast-firing weapon like Mesa's Regulators, the AoE potential of every single shot here is absolutely ludicrous. So this right here would be the new build for my Regulators. In the arcane slot, we of course go for Secondary Irradiate, which beforehand I was using Secondary Outburst. This one gives massive crit chance and crit damage to your Regulators, and therefore is the stronger option when you go for single targets. However, given how strong the Regulators are already, I think that adding the 7-meter AoE potential from Secondary Irradiate here will actually net you higher kills per second. As for the mods, we go for Galvanized Diffusion, giving us much more multi-shot. Galvanized Shot right here, we're not necessarily using this for the status chance, although a bit more of this is definitely appreciated, but mainly for the 120% more damage that we're gonna get for each individual status type on the enemy. Together with Hornet Strike right here, this will give us a fat dose of base damage. Then, as we previously figured out, the Regulators are a crit weapon, so we want to have more crit chance and crit damage, which we do with Primed Target Cracker, 110% more crit damage, and Primed Pistol Gambit for 187% more crit chance. If you wanted to, or maybe if you don't have Primed Pistol Gambit, you could instead use Creeping Bullseye. This one has 13% more crit chance, however you do sacrifice 20% fire rate, which means overall I think it's not worth it. But again, if your only alternative here would be normal Pistol Gambit, then definitely go for Creeping Bullseye. Up next, because we don't have any ammo restrictions, we're gonna make sure to have as much of a fire rate as possible by modding Anemic Agility right here. This gives us 90% more fire rate. Then I went for a faction damage mod, but if you don't like faction damage, you could replace this one here with literally anything else. And finally, it is very important that we put heat damage on this weapon. The reason why it has to be heat damage here becomes much clearer as we're going to take a look into the Mesa build itself right now. And you might be wondering, well, doesn't Secondary Irradiate only trigger if enemies have radiation on them? You're not even dealing radiation damage, so what the heck is going on here? Well, hold that thought for just a minute, because also this is going to become much clearer when we take a look at the main Mesa build. So how about we do that right now? But alright, let's finally talk about the main portion of the video, how to build your Mesa herself. First of all, let's take a quick look at our helmet ability. As we said in the skill section already, we're gonna replace our first ability because this one, while being nice in its own niche, doesn't do anything for our build today. As for which helmet ability we're gonna pick, we actually have multiple options today. First of all, if you want to run very high level content, while you want to be even tankier than your personal damage reduction ability allows you, you can always go for Eclipse from Mirage and get another 75% damage reduction on top of that. Roar from Rhino is always a solid option too. However, thinking back of our secondary Irradiate Arcane, we still don't have any way to apply radiation to the enemies, so one way you could maybe do that would also be infusing Chirinka Pillar from Corvex. With this skill, you can put up to 2 pillars on the field, which have quite a nice duration and emit energy pulses which apply radiation to all enemies in its AoE. This helmet is definitely viable, however I personally feel like it takes a bit too long for those pillars to get the enemies up to the maximum of 10 stacks, which is why I decided to get my radiation in a different way that we're gonna talk about later. And instead, I decided to infuse Grendel's Nourish. What a shocker, right? Because it's just really good on Mesa, not only giving you viral priming on the enemies, but also solving all energy issues that you might otherwise run into. But whoever says helmet skill also of course needs to say Archon shards, so let's take a look at them here too. What I personally did here, and that is the first reason why I put heat damage on my regulators, is I went for 5 orange shards, all increasing my crit chance up to 50%, and the way you do this is by taking out enemies that have heat on them. With all of these 5 shards here, I will get a total crit chance bonus of plus 250%. However, if you're a real mad lad and you want to go for full Tau Forged oranges, then you could increase that to a total of 375%. However, the 5 orange all into crit, that's just what I personally did. In reality though, there's actually a bit of a stronger option with this build, and that would be, instead of using all orange shards just for the crit bonus, instead take 2 or 3 of those orange shards and use the stat that gives you plus 10% ability damage against enemies affected by radiation. This is very strong here because Mesa's regulators are an exalted weapon and therefore count as an ability, so they benefit from this ability damage stat, and even though 10% doesn't sound like much, it, in fact, is a separate multiplier, meaning this damage bonus is multiplicative to all other sources of regulators damage. So, long story short, even though I went into full crit chance bonus here, in reality I think it would be better to put 2 or 3 of your shards into the ability damage for radiation instead. But now, let's take a look at our Mesa build herself. First of all, in the aura, I went for Growing Power, which increases our ability strength. If you, however, have a different preference here, it would be fine to also replace it. As an Excellus mod, I went for Mesa's Waltz, which allows me to walk around while being in Regulators mode. Also here, this one is for personal preference. If you think you don't need it, you could go for anything else here. Survivability comes from shield tanking with primed redirection as well as adaptation, which gives us up to 90% damage reduction on top. Combined with this one here, we're never gonna go down, I promise. In order to never run out of energy, we go for Primed Flow, which increases our maximum energy to over 500, and Equilibrium, which will make sure that in combination with Nourish, we will have so much energy income, it's gonna be crazy. We also go for a bit of duration to keep our buffs up longer. I right here use Archon Continuity because I tend to play this Mesa build right here with other regulator builds too where I can actually benefit from this effect, but purely looking at today's video, we could also replace this with the Prime version because for this build today, Archon actually doesn't do anything specific here. And then finally, of course, we need a whole bunch of ability strength because the more ability strength we have, the more damage we deal. So Transient Fortitude, Blind Rage, Precision Intensify it is. But now let's take a quick look at the Arcanes. In the first slot, we have Arcane Hotshot. This one can give us an additional plus 300% whopping crit chance to our regulators, and the way we stack it is by inflicting heat status effect with abilities. That is the second reason why we need to have heat on our regulators. And then in the other Arcane slot, I gotta admit, this one is a bit more of a flex slot. I really like high crit chance on Mesa, which is why I went for Arcane Avenger, but if you wanted to, you could also do something else here, maybe more ability strength, maybe even arcane expertise if you feel like you want to have even more shields on Mesa, or also very nice, Arcane Impetus, which can give you crazy tons of ability strength and efficiency, and you can actually stack this pretty nicely if you were to use Secondary Encumber instead on your Regulators. Not gonna do that today, just showing you a couple of options. So yeah, this would be the Mesa build, but before you click away, we still haven't talked about how we actually apply radiation to the enemies, have we? So let's do that right now by going over the rest of our loadout, which is crucial to buff this build up even more. First of all, as a melee weapon, we use the Furax, the Furax Wraith, or the MK1 Furax. The reason why it has to be a weapon from the Furax family is the mod Amalgam Furax body count, because this mod can only be applied to Furax type weapons and it has a passive stat that gives you plus 45% fire rate to secondary weapons. And because the Regulators are considered pistols, that fire rate bonus also applies to them, making the Furax a nice stat stick. But that's not all. What's new here is also Melee Corrine, which was added with last week's update too, and what this one does is, when you roll around, you will automatically freeze all enemies that are close to you. This is especially good on Mesa, because rolling around is very common with her, as this is an easy way to move around while being in regulator mode. And what this freeze effect does is, on the one hand, it would allow you to theoretically use Arcane Ice Storm on your Mesa, giving you ability strength and duration, which are two stats that she really likes, so that would be a good synergy option. But even if you don't go for Arcane Ice Storm, you can still benefit from enemies being frozen, because frozen enemies take more crit damage, so it's indirectly buffing the damage of your Regulators too. That would be the first synergy. Secondly, if you really wanted to min-max the ever-living crap out of this, you could also use the Aphentis as your primary weapon, because when you throw this one in the ground, it also creates a bit of an AoE in which you gain even more fire rate, but I personally just don't like using this because it's kinda clunky to play. Just showing you the options, decide for yourself. However, the most vital component of our loadout today would be our companion, and here the best option to go for would be Nautilus Prime. First of all, with Nautilus, going for the Prime over the normal variant is actually beneficial because the Prime version can get over 1200 shields. This then allows you to use Reinforced Bond, which gives you another 60% fire rate to your weapons, even further increasing the DPS of our Regulators. And of course, Nautilus is known for his skill Cordon, which will automatically group up nearby enemies for you, giving your Regulators even crazier kills per second, because when enemies are grouped, that means more enemies get hit by the AoE damage of Secondary Irradiate, and that is exactly what we want. And then finally, let's also talk about how we actually get the radiation on the enemies in the first place, and the way we do that is with the Tazakor. This one is the weapon for our companion, and the way it works is, it shoots a beam of electricity that links to up to 4 enemies. This right here is how I built the Tazakor, basically just a whole lot of fire rate and status chance and a lot of radiation here. And we then combine this with this Nautilus build right here, where we have to go for Duplex Bond, which will create up to 3 clones of our Nautilus, and each and every one of them, Nautilus plus the clones, are gonna shoot with their Tazakors at enemies, inflicting all of them with 10 radiation stacks in absolutely no time. The rest of the build that you see here is somewhat free and comes down to personal preference. I like to go for Guardian because it gives me additional survivability, Manifold Bond because it decreases the cooldown of our grouping ability Cordon right here, so that is definitely nice to have, and Synth Deconstruct to create more health orbs that we can then turn into energy with Equilibrium and Nourish. Just one thing that is very important to keep in mind here: if you use Assault mode to allow your Nautilus to attack the enemies with a Tazakor, you have to make sure that Cordon is placed before Assault mode. If you swap the two ones out, then Nautilus will basically never group up enemies, because the way the companion skills work is, they always try to prioritize the skills that happen earlier in the mod build, and given the fact that they can always attack an enemy, they will always prioritize shooting over grouping. This way, we're gonna swap them out, which means they will prioritize grouping and only start shooting the enemies if the grouping tool is on cooldown, which is exactly what we want. And if you haven't yet, then definitely also check out my full build guide on the new Warframe Muriel right here. Another massive shout out to Niels V, Demonoidzel, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nost Linux Gaming, Turtlepeer, Ondakane02, Skylabauza, Mihawki, Socrates the Almighty Rat, Leo Morazaki, Shadow Lockhart, Antagas, Baitrusader, Boomia1, Mr. Games Plays, Zave, Awindai, Zengen, Quax, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.